The morning started like any other. David sat at the table holding his tablet in one hand, the other resting on a half-finished cup of coffee. His face seemed absorbed in the screen, but I knew his thoughts were elsewhere. Beside him, a small jewelry box sat on the table. A gift meant to warm the heart, but instead it only deepened the distance between us. I poured myself some coffee, trying not to dwell on the fact that we had become strangers. The room was silent, broken only by the soft clink of a spoon against porcelain. David glanced up briefly, meeting my gaze for a split second before lowering it again. His coldness was nothing new, but today it cut deeper. The jewelry box on the table felt more like an obligation than a genuine gesture. James walked into the kitchen. His light stride and relaxed posture always gave off an air of calm, but I knew there was more complexity beneath the surface. He glanced at the table, then smirked. "You two look so serious. Did someone forget a birthday?" He joked. I smiled, shifting my focus back to David. David put down his tablet, exhaling sharply. "When will you start thinking about your future?" he asked, his tone more commanding than caring. Those words, more of an order than concern, shattered the fragile peace of the morning. James raised an eyebrow at him. "My future can wait until tomorrow, Dad." I watched their silent standoff. James rarely fought back, but I could see how deeply these constant criticisms cut. Later, after James left and the kitchen returned to its quiet stillness, David spoke. "I'll have to leave earlier than planned. Work, as always." I nodded, masking my relief. "I'll manage the house. Don't worry," I said with a smile. When he left for his office, I was left alone. Loneliness had become a constant companion, even when he was home. There was no open conflict in our marriage, but there was no closeness either. I picked up the jewelry box and opened it. Inside was a ring, perfect, shiny, but soulless. It felt like part of a life we both maintained, but where I had long stopped feeling alive. My thoughts wandered back to James. His calmness, his confidence in taking his time to figure things out. Unlike David, he didn't make me feel like a partner in a business contract, and that was refreshing. Perhaps that was the root of my longing. I didn't crave luxury or gifts. I craved warmth and attention. The simple understanding that I could be important to someone. James walked back into the kitchen, now wearing headphones. He glanced at me briefly and threw out something like, "Don't forget about lunch, Mom," before walking off. I stared out the window, feeling the emptiness inside me begin to grow. The next morning, I woke up earlier than everyone else. The sun had just risen over the horizon, its light gently filtering through the sheer curtains, filling the room with a warm, golden glow. Our suitcases, neatly packed by David the night before, stood on the floor. His meticulousness always added a sense of formality to trips, turning every journey into a structured task rather than a spontaneous adventure. I quietly got ready, careful not to wake the others. James was asleep in the next room, his soft, steady breathing audible through the thin walls. David was still in bed, his face peaceful. It was a rare moment to see him so relaxed, almost unrecognizable without his usual mask of a business-minded man. When we loaded the car, the morning had fully bloomed and the air buzzed with the anticipation of the trip. The drive to the coast was unhurried and surprisingly serene. James immediately took the passenger seat beside me, leaving David to immerse himself in phone calls in the back. "Still working, huh?" James remarked, glancing at the rearview mirror with a faint smirk. I didn't respond, merely shrugged. There was no point in trying to interfere with David's habits. When we finally arrived at the hotel, the gentle hum of the ocean greeted us, as if promising peace. Our rooms were on the top floor, offering a breathtaking view of the endless beach. After unpacking, we all headed down to the shore for a walk. David walked a few steps ahead, his phone screen glowing as usual. At some point, he stopped and turned around, saying he needed to take a work call. "I'll catch up later," he said curtly, disappearing among the sparse crowd of tourists. Left alone with James, I felt a subtle tension, though he seemed completely at ease. His confident strides on the sand and his relaxed posture exuded a calm I had long forgotten. "You know, I think I've gotten used to Dad always being busy," he began, gazing at the horizon. I simply nodded. There was nothing to say because his words reflected my own truth. We continued walking along the shore, our conversation shifting to his interests. He spoke about his plans for the future, still forming but full of ambition. "You've grown so quickly," I said, interrupting his thoughts. James tilted his head slightly toward me, and there was something unexpected in his gaze. Warmth I hadn't anticipated. "And you haven't changed at all, Mom. You've only gotten more beautiful." I felt something stir inside me, but I quickly hid it behind a faint smile. Later, at the dinner David had arranged for his colleagues, I once again felt isolated. The conversations revolved around deals, contracts, and business projects that held no interest for me. James sat beside me, and his presence unexpectedly became the only warm island in this cold world. He shared childhood stories with me, and those brief moments filled my soul with something I had been missing for far too long. But there was something else in his gaze that I couldn't ignore. His eyes lingered on me a moment too long, his smile too gentle. When the evening ended, I felt a strange unease. It was both frightening and thrilling, making me wonder where it would all lead. The next day, I tried once again to spend time with David. He was usually a man who valued order, but in recent months I had noticed how often his attention drifted away from us. I approached him with the suggestion to take a walk along the shore, enjoying the day without work concerns. But he responded without lifting his eyes from the screen. "I can't. I need to finish a couple of things." I stood still, watching his hands consumed by the phone once again. With every passing year, it was getting harder to make him focus on anything other than work. I realized that all initiatives in our family always came from me, and despite all my love and patience, the feeling of loneliness never left me. David and I had long stopped talking about what was bothering me, and no matter how much I tried, these attempts always proved futile. In moments like this, I wanted more, something that could bring the lost warmth back to our relationship. When I walked out to the beach to distract myself a bit, James was already there. He suggested we play beach volleyball, and I agreed with pleasure. There was such ease and confidence in his movements, as if he was born for it. We quickly got into the game, and I noticed how he, smiling, helped me, guiding me on how to position my hand or where to aim the ball. Every touch of his, even the slightest, made my heart skip a beat. His hand accidentally brushed my shoulder, and the laughter I heard sounded so familiar, like something I had been missing. Later in the evening, I decided to walk over to the pool to relax a little. The water beckoned with its coolness, and I quickly dove in, feeling how it refreshed my body. James, as always, was nearby. He offered to join me, and I didn't object. Instead of the usual small talk about the weather, we discussed something more personal. He confessed that he had always felt neglected by his father, though he had never shared it with him. His words were sincere, and his gaze thoughtful. Something about him wasn't the same as usual. He said that he had always felt supported only by me. I didn't know how to respond because "you're important to me too" didn't seem enough in that moment. When we were walking back to the hotel, the air was warm, and the evening silence felt especially dense. James walked beside me, and at one point his hand accidentally brushed against my waist. It was a moment that made me shiver, feeling my heart race. I tried to focus on something else, but the memory of the touch didn't leave me. He didn't notice how deeply it affected me, continuing to walk beside me. I tried to hide the wave in my chest, but in my mind, there was no longer any doubt. He had become something more to me than just a relative. The morning of David's departure arrived with its usual clarity. The suitcases stood by the door, silent reminders of his relentless schedule. I helped him pack the last of his things, feeling the unspoken words catch in my throat. "You'll be fine, I know it," he said, fastening the strap on his travel bag. His voice sounded like a perfunctory reassurance. I smiled in response, unwilling to reveal how deeply his detachment stung. He left quickly, without looking back. His kiss on my cheek was as cold and fleeting as everything that connected us in recent years. When he drove away, the house was filled with a strange calm. I stood by the window for a long time, watching his car disappear from view, before James approached me with the suggestion to take the boat to a small cove. We rowed slowly along the shore, and I found myself thinking about how quiet it was. The water was mirror smooth, the sun dipping low on the horizon and casting soft reflections on its surface. "Do you remember when we came here once, back when I was about 9? He asked, breaking the silence. I nodded, recalling that day. Back then, David and I still made time for such family outings, and James, as a child, was always the center of attention. "You were the only person who ever believed in me," he said, gazing into the distance. Those words resonated deep inside me. I heard in them the kind of sincerity I had been missing for years, but I tried not to show how much they affected me. The sun was setting, painting the sky in deep golden pink hues. We stopped at the cove, where cliffs formed a secluded corner, as if shielding us from the rest of the world. James turned to me. "Thank you for everything you've done for me," he said, his voice warm. Too warm. I barely had time to nod before he leaned in and kissed me. For a fraction of a second, I froze, but then I pulled away. My hand rose instinctively and I slapped him. The gesture was as sharp as the emotions that surged through me in that moment. I didn't look back. I didn't say a word. As if escaping my own weakness, I headed straight for the boat. My legs trembled slightly, but I walked quickly, gritting my teeth to keep from panicking. Climbing into the boat, I grabbed the oars and rowed away from the shore. James stayed where he was, making no attempt to stop me. The water around me was calm, and I rowed further, feeling my heart racing wildly. I wanted to be alone, to sort through what had just happened. The air around me seemed heavier, the sun hotter, but none of that mattered. At that moment, I realized how long it had been since I had felt anything like this. Fear, confusion, or a pounding heartbeat. It all reminded me of the parts of myself I had tried to suppress for so many years. The drive home began in silence, broken only by the hum of the engine and James's occasional remarks. We were both tired, but my thoughts drifted far from the mundane. Just as everything seemed routine, the car unexpectedly stalled. James quickly stepped out, taking charge of the situation. I watched as he studied the engine, his movements deliberate and focused. He seemed calm, even slightly pleased, as if the minor setback was a welcome challenge. "Try starting it now," he called over his shoulder. I turned the ignition, but the car only made a weak clicking noise. After half an hour of attempts, it was clear we wouldn't be going any further that night. We had no choice but to find the nearest motel. The place was as worn out as we were. Dim walls, creaky floors, and a musty smell. The only available room was small, with a single bed that dominated the space. I felt the air grow heavy the moment we were alone. James tried to lighten the mood with a joke, but his voice carried more awkwardness than humor. I nodded, avoiding his gaze for too long. I headed to the bathroom, eager to freshen up and shake off the weight of the day. Leaving the door slightly ajar, I began undressing. My body felt tense, but the thought of warm water promised some relief. Standing in my underwear, I paused at the mirror, quickly tidying my hair. That's when I felt it, a gaze. Turning my head slowly, I noticed James lying on the bed, leaning against the headboard. His eyes were fixed on me, and he made no effort to look away. His gaze traced my body, studying every curve and line. I froze, unsure of what to say. His expression was too candid, and the room suddenly felt unbearably hot. My heart raced. Gathering my composure, I shut the door firmly. The sound of running water helped me regain some semblance of calm. But inside, everything was boiling. Something within me was tearing apart. Guilt, embarrassment, anger, all tangled together. When I returned to the room, James pretended to be absorbed in his phone. I said nothing, simply turning off the lights to avoid his gaze. But even in the darkness, I could feel his presence, his attention. I knew there was a dangerous line between us, and every step closer threatened to cross it. The night at the motel felt endless. I lay on the edge of the bed, turned toward the wall, trying not to notice James. But even so, I could feel his presence behind me, the warmth of his body uncomfortably close. Silence filled the room, but it wasn't the kind that brought peace. It was tense, heavy, hanging in the air like an unspoken question. My heart was beating too fast, my thoughts swirling in my head, and my body couldn't find rest. "I can't stay silent," James said suddenly. His voice was barely audible, but it carried so much tension that I immediately tensed up. I didn't respond, hoping he would stop, but he continued. "The kiss, It was spontaneous. I didn't mean to do it, or rather I did, but I didn't think I actually would. I turned onto my back, staring at the ceiling. His words burned, making my pulse thrum in my temples. "It was a mistake," I said softly, almost a whisper. "Maybe," he replied, and there was so much regret in his voice that I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. But I can't deny how I feel. I closed my eyes, trying to shut him out, to shut out my thoughts and the weight pressing on my chest. "This is wrong," I said. "You understand that, right? This wasn't supposed to happen." He didn't reply immediately, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. But it did. His words hung in the air, a barrier between us that was both strong and fragile. I didn't know how to continue the conversation, so I just turned away again, hoping he would stop talking. As I was beginning to drift off, feeling fatigue taking over, his hand lightly brushed against mine. It was so gentle, as if he was afraid of even the smallest touch. I didn't move, didn't pull away, though my mind screamed at me to break the contact. His fingers were warm, soft, lying close to mine, creating an odd sense of comfort. We both froze, as if scared of making any further movement. Gradually, my muscles relaxed, and the warmth of his hand became something familiar. Sleep began to take me, and I didn't resist. I didn't try to break this closeness. We fell asleep like that, with light touches that spoke more than any words ever could. The morning began with a brief phone call. We had the car towed to the nearest repair shop. The mechanic, lazily scratching his head, informed us it would take at least a day to fix. This meant one thing: we had to spend another night at the motel. I called David, trying to keep my voice calm and composed. As usual, he was busy, his responses clipped and distracted. "Everything's fine," I said when he asked how we were doing. "The car broke down, but it's no problem. We're fine." "I trust you'll handle it," he replied before quickly ending the call. When I hung up, a strange feeling settled inside me. He hadn't even paused to consider how I might be feeling. All he cared about was that the situation was under control. But I couldn't blame him. I had built this image of myself as a woman who always knew what to do. By evening, we were back in the same motel room. The space felt even smaller than the night before. The tension between us had grown so thick it seemed to fill every corner. James lay silently on the bed while I went to the bathroom to get ready for sleep. When I returned, his eyes were closed, but I knew he wasn't asleep. I lay down on the far edge of the bed, trying to maintain some distance, but soon I felt his body shift closer. His arm slid around my waist. The touch was gentle, but there was a newfound confidence in it. My body froze for a moment, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I turned toward him, finding myself almost pressed against him. His breath became more audible, warmer. I closed my eyes, feeling the heat of his hands burning against my skin. There were no words between us. None were needed. The boundary that once existed dissolved in an instant, vanishing into the space left only for us. His hands slowly moved down my body, tracing every line, every curve. My heart was pounding, but I didn't resist, didn't pull back. Everything I had suppressed for years was now breaking free. His lips touched my neck, then my shoulder, leaving a trail of heat that I felt in every fiber of my being. My hands reached for him instinctively, gripping his back, pulling him closer. Each movement, each touch grew more fervent. We couldn't stop, as if the air around us had ignited, consuming us in its flames. His lips found mine. His hands seemed to know every hidden fear, every buried desire. Our breaths intertwined. Reality disappeared, leaving only our bodies, our emotions, our desires. I no longer thought about what would happen next. I allowed myself to be consumed by my feelings, to let the passion take over completely. The morning after that night was silent. I woke up before James and stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours, enveloped in the heavy quiet of the room. The air felt thick, saturated with the memories of what had happened. When James woke up, our eyes met, but neither of us said a word. There was something complicated in his gaze, a mixture of embarrassment and unspoken pain I couldn't fully understand. I turned away, busying myself with my belongings, trying not to think. though every detail reminded me of the night before. We picked up the car from the repair shop without exchanging more than a few necessary words. The drive home was steeped in silence, neither of us daring to break it. It was as if we were both lost in our own thoughts, analyzing what had gone wrong, or perhaps what couldn't be undone. When the house finally came into view, I felt a strange combination of relief and dread. I wasn't sure how I would look David in the eye, how I would conceal the part of myself that seemed to have lost control. David was waiting for us on the porch, his face lighting up with a faint smile. "Everything okay?" he asked, picking up one of the bags. "Yes, just a small delay with the car," I replied, trying to sound as natural as possible. James said nothing, avoiding his father's gaze as he disappeared into his room. His silence made the already tense atmosphere even heavier. When I was alone with David, he noticed something was off. "You look tired," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Is everything all right?" I avoided his gaze, focusing on unpacking the bags. "Everything's fine. Just a long drive," I said, hoping to deflect his attention. His stare lingered, as if he were trying to read my thoughts, but I kept my eyes down, afraid that meeting his gaze would betray me. That evening, David suggested we spend time together as a family watching a movie. He picked a lighthearted comedy, assuring us it would help us relax. I agreed, hoping to restore some semblance of normalcy, but the tension in the room was palpable. We sat on the couch, David in the armchair, while James and I ended up side by side on the sofa. Despite my efforts to keep some distance, it gradually diminished. The movie played in the background, but I couldn't focus. I felt James's gaze on me. It wasn't overt, but it was there, unmistakable. At one point, our hands accidentally brushed. It was a fleeting, barely noticeable touch, but my skin burned from it, and my heart pounded so loudly I thought everyone in the room could hear it. I cautiously pulled my hand away, trying to maintain composure, but it was nearly impossible. David seemed oblivious. He laughed at the screen, unaware of the tension that had become almost tangible between James and me. When the movie ended, I quickly got up, excusing myself under the pretense of being tired, and retreated to the bedroom. Alone, I tried to gather my thoughts. David suspected nothing. His confidence in the stability of our marriage was absolute, but I could feel everything crumbling beneath the surface, and I knew it was only a matter of time. The morning was like any other, but the tension in the house was more palpable than ever. David had started noticing changes in our behavior. His gaze lingered on me longer than usual, and James could feel his scrutiny too, making every interaction between us even more awkward. David rarely voiced his suspicions, but his questions hinted at unease. "Are you hiding something?" he asked one day when we were alone in the kitchen. "Of course not," I replied calmly, giving him no reason to doubt me. But inside, I could feel his confidence in our stability beginning to crack. That evening, when David left for a meeting, I knew staying alone with James was risky. I tried to keep my distance, but the tension between us was magnetic, pulling us closer. I was standing by the window when I heard his footsteps. They were quiet, but purposeful. "We need to talk," he said, stopping beside me. "It's better if we don't," I replied without turning around. "You can't keep pretending nothing happened." His voice trembled but carried a resolute tone. I turned to face him. His expression was serious, his gaze filled with emotions he could no longer hide. "It was a mistake," I said, trying to end the conversation. But he stepped closer. My heart pounded louder and my thoughts seemed to vanish. When his hands rested on my shoulders, I wanted to pull away, but I couldn't. His lips met mine and it was too sudden, too intense. I was lost in the moment, unable to process what was happening. Then the sound of the door closing snapped me back to reality. I pulled away abruptly, turning my head. David stood in the doorway. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, they were filled with questions and confusion. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice tense but controlled. My head spun with panic, but I quickly composed myself. What are you talking about?" I forced a smile, acting as though nothing unusual had happened. He glanced between us, his eyes lingering on James, who had stepped back, trying to appear indifferent. "You looked like you'd seen something strange," I continued. David frowned, but then relaxed slightly. He averted his eyes, as if battling his own thoughts. Maybe I imagined it, he muttered, shaking his head. I felt the tension begin to ease, though inside I was still churning. You're probably just tired, I said as gently as I could. He nodded, casting one last glance at both of us before heading to his room. When his footsteps faded, I sank into a chair, my body trembling. James said nothing, silently retreating upstairs. But I knew. This had been far too close. The days after that evening felt like moving through a fog. David's watchfulness grew, his gaze lingering longer than I was comfortable with. I could feel him noticing the changes, even if he hesitated to voice his suspicions. The tension in the house became palpable, building with each passing day. One evening, he came into the kitchen as I was cleaning up. His silence spoke volumes. He stood, leaning against the counter, watching me. You seem different, he said finally, his voice laden with quiet doubt. I kept my back to him, focusing on the task at hand. It's just exhaustion, I replied, keeping my tone even. I knew my words were too simple to fully dispel his unease. But David, though he watched me for a long moment, didn't press further. He nodded, perhaps convincing himself it was all in his mind. When he left, I sank into a chair, the tension inside me spreading like a wildfire. I knew his trust was cracking, and one wrong move could shatter everything. Later that night, James appeared in my room. His steps were quick, his movements purposeful. His eyes burned with an intensity that made my breath catch. You should be with me, he said abruptly. I looked at him. His confidence frightened me. He didn't understand how dangerous his impulsiveness was, how much it threatened everything I was trying to hold together. I stayed silent, letting his words hang in the air as he stepped closer. His energy was overwhelming. He was certain his desires outweighed everything else, that what we felt justified it all. I sighed, the weight of our situation pressing down on me like a stone. If I let this continue, everything will fall apart, I thought. Finally, I found my voice. You're a threat to our future, to this family, I said coldly, my words like ice. His confidence wavered, but only for a moment. He tried to speak, to argue, but I stopped him with a look. Quietly, firmly, I said, We can spend time together, but only when he's not here. It can't be more than that, it's the only way. His face froze. He seemed to wrestle with the idea, but eventually he nodded silently. When he left, I felt the weight of my decisions settle over me like a fragile bridge suspended over an abyss. The balance was precarious, the risk too great. That evening began like any other. I was in the bedroom exhausted from the events of the past few days. David was still in his office, and I allowed myself a few moments of silence to gather my thoughts. But that silence was deceptive. Inside, everything was in turmoil. My phone rested on my lap. I stared at the screen, rereading the latest messages from James. They were warm, intimate, even too personal. His words were dangerous, but I couldn't stop myself. A part of me was drawn to him despite understanding the absurdity of it all. Miss me? His message read. Slowly, I typed a reply. Yes, but you already know that. Suddenly, the door opened. I looked up sharply and saw David. His face was calm, but there was something unsettling in that calm. What are you writing? He asked, his eyes fixed on the phone in my hands. Nothing important, just texting. I tried to keep my tone steady, but my voice wavered. He stepped closer, his movements deliberate, as if he already knew what he would find. Before I could react, he snatched the phone from my hands. David, give it back! I raised my voice, but he was already looking at the screen. The silence that followed was deafening. His face turned pale, his eyes widening in shock. He held the phone as if it burned his fingers. What is this? He asked, his voice low but full of an impending storm. I couldn't answer. The words caught in my throat. Is this James? He looked up at me. Are you serious? I tried to speak but couldn't. Panic consumed me while David's voice rose, filled with anger and pain. How could you? How far has this gone? His questions hit like blows. I knew he wanted answers, but what could I say? That it was a mistake? That it should never have happened? All of it would sound like pitiful excuses. When he threw the phone onto the bed, his expression was one of pure disdain. You've destroyed everything, he said quietly. He left, slamming the door behind him, leaving me alone. I sat on the bed, feeling tremors run through my body. The phone still lay beside me, its screen dark, but I didn't need to turn it on to remember what it said. I couldn't return to the life I'd had before. David knew, and that changed everything. But I didn't know what to do next. The choice felt impossible. I was standing on the edge, teetering between two lives, neither of which could ever be whole again. The next morning began with emptiness. James hadn't come home after the previous night's fight. The house was steeped in a heavy silence that only deepened my guilt and unease. David avoided me, asking no questions, but his silence spoke louder than words. I knew he was waiting for an explanation, but I couldn't gather my thoughts. By midday, I left the house, hoping to clear my mind. The fresh air didn't help. Every step I took reminded me of the fracture I had created. On a quiet street near the park, I saw him. James stood at the edge of the sidewalk, slightly hunched, as if trying not to be noticed. When he saw me, something flickered in his eyes, a mix of relief and desperation. "I've been waiting for you," he said as he approached. I didn't respond, standing still and giving him space to say what he needed to. "Come with me," he blurted out, his voice firm but trembling. "We can start over, without him, without this house, without all this tension." His words hit me like a shockwave. They sounded so simple, yet their weight was unbearable. "You don't understand what you're asking," I replied quietly. "I do," he said, grabbing my hand. "I feel alive with you. You know there's something real between us." I looked away. His words hurt, but they also pulled at me. With him, I felt something I'd long lost in my marriage to David. Passion, desire, the freshness of emotion. But could I leave everything behind for it? "James," I said, pulling my hand away. "It's not that simple." He stared at me, his eyes filled with a silent plea. "It's the only way," he whispered. I shook my head silently. I couldn't make a decision now. When I returned home, I found David in the living room. He was sitting in the armchair, clutching a cup of tea, but his gaze wasn't on the drink. It was lost somewhere deep in his thoughts. "We need to talk," he said when I entered. I stopped by the door, unsure of what to say. "I can see that something's wrong with our family," he continued. "We've grown distant, and we can't ignore it." He spoke calmly, but his voice carried a weight of pain. "I don't want us to fall apart. We can fix this, but I need to know if you want that too." I stood there in silence, his words echoing in my head. David wanted to fight for us, despite everything. But how could I answer, knowing what I was hiding? I don't know," I finally said, barely audible. He looked at me for a long moment, his gaze piercing, then nodded as if taking my silence as an answer. "Think about it, Emma. But don't take too long," he said, rising from the chair. When he left, I remained alone in the room, feeling the weight of my choices grow unbearable. The house felt like a cage, and the days dragged on endlessly. James still hadn't returned, and the air was thick with the sense of an impending conclusion. My heart raced with every phone call or the sound of footsteps outside. My entire life seemed to be suspended, waiting for the inevitable. But James wasn't going to stay silent. He found me as I was heading to the store. His appearance was sudden but not unexpected. His eyes were filled with determination, leaving no room for doubt. "You need to decide," he said, giving me no chance to evade. I tried to brush him off, but he blocked my path. "I can't do this anymore, Emma. You have to choose." His words hit me like a blow. I stood silent, trying to gather myself, but emotions surged inside me. His confidence was terrifying, but it was also part of what had drawn me to him. "James, it's not that simple," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes filled with pain, but he said nothing more. He turned and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. When I returned home, I found David preparing for a trip. His face was focused, his movements purposeful. "I thought we should spend the weekend together," he said, looking at me. I couldn't refuse. His attempt seemed genuine, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. My feelings were elsewhere, and no amount of effort could fix that. When he left me to pack, I messaged James. This was meant to be our last meeting. I wanted to explain, to put an end to things, and give us both a chance to move on. We met at the park. I stared at him for a long moment, searching for the right words. "James, this has to end," I finally said, but my resolve quickly faltered under his gaze. He stepped closer, his hands resting on my shoulders. "You can't just end this," he whispered, his voice low but full of passion. And I couldn't resist. His lips found mine, and everything I'd planned to say dissolved in that moment. My head spun, my body yielded to his touch. This was our farewell intimacy, but it felt inevitable, like the final act between us. When I returned home, the house was empty. I felt drained, his words and touches still echoing in my mind. On the table was a note from David. Its short message sent a chill through me. "I understand everything. I hope you find what you're looking for." I sank into a chair, feeling the ground shift beneath me. This was the beginning of the end, and I knew my life would never be the same. I reread the lines over and over. What did he mean? Did he truly know everything? Or were these just suspicions? If the truth came out, what would I lose? The house? The family? The stability that had been my anchor for so long. But wasn't that stability already a lie? The family wasn't the same anymore. Every day spent in this house only deepened the cracks I had created myself. And yet the thought of everything falling apart was terrifying. I had seen families shatter, how quickly people became strangers. Could I endure that? The phone rang. I flinched, pulled back into reality. James's name lit up the screen. I knew he wouldn't let this go easily. "I'll come get you," he said when I answered. His voice was calm, but there was urgency in it. "Just say the word and we'll start over." My heart clenched. "James," I began, but I couldn't continue. "You know you want this," he said. "Just tell me." I closed my eyes. The words caught in my throat. After a long pause, I finally said, "We need time." I heard him exhale. "All right," he replied, "but I won't wait forever." When the call ended, a heavy sense of inevitability hung in the air. A few minutes later, I heard the door slam. David was home. His footsteps were steady but slightly hesitant, as if he was deliberating what to say. I looked up, trying to appear calm, but my face must have betrayed me. David stopped, his gaze landing on the note still lying beside me. "Do you have something to say?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I stood, my knees trembling slightly. Our eyes met, and I realized he already knew everything. Maybe not the details, but the essence. He knew. The words stuck in my throat. I opened my mouth to say something, but nothing came out. In that moment, everything seemed to freeze. I saw the tension in his face, the pain and expectation in his eyes. His gaze told me that this was it. One word, one phrase, and our fate would be sealed. But I couldn't say anything.